So my name is Rick Shone, and I'm running for mayor. I'm a candidate for mayor. It's something that I had decided to pursue back in 2018 after watching the election debate on TV and feeling really quite disappointed that we didn't have more people who would step up. And so in the last 4 years, I've actually had the opportunity to speak with Mayor Bowman and a few things, and I've been a little critical about some of his things. I've been challenged not to be an armchair mayor. And so thinking really hard on that and being a really proud and passionate Winnipegger, I did decide to put my name forward in May after months of sort of sleeplessness and making sure that I could commit and wanted to commit to such an important role in the city. So that was kind of a really brief synopsis on my journey, but ultimately I'm a small business owner in Winnipeg. I have 2 children. My wife is a police officer here in Winnipeg, and just a proud Winnipegger who hopes to really make some action and build a city that we can all be proud of.
So we have 6 items on our citizens agenda, Rick, and the first is homelessness. I believe that is Shauna. Shauna, just introduce yourself to the microphone and ask away.
Yeah, I'm Shone Trinley, so I am doing homelessness, which is a prominent issue within our city. Yeah. So I just want to hear your thoughts on homelessness, like generally, and what that looks like in Winnipeg and what your plan is.
Yeah. So a lot of things that are major issues in the city, I relate to some personal experience. And I have a family member who has been in and out of homelessness over the years due to addictions, and so that was sort of where my learning and I guess journey with homelessness in our city has started. When I moved my business down to not too far from here on Notre Dame and Isabel, I started to get involved with many of the organizations that were also downtown, just to learn about some of the major challenges that Winnipeg's most vulnerable people do have. And so I started volunteering with the Main Street Project, and boy, I'll tell you, I learned a lot. I always thought I was a fairly compassionate person, but when I started volunteering with them, I learned a whole new level of compassion, just working with people and meeting them where they are at right now with no judgment. And we actually are just about to do this in a couple of weeks. We actually pay for our whole staff to close on Black Friday and take our whole staff to volunteer at Main Street Project. But long story short, that is also being in this neighborhood and walking around and working with organizations like Main Street Project. I also sat on the board of Central Neighborhoods Association for a couple of years. And so through that, we have harm reduction strategies that we employed through Central Neighborhoods Association as well. Our area where our business is, this has been called the poorest postal code in Canada. And so it is quite, the challenges are quite different in a lot of ways to some of the rest of Winnipeg. So some of the major things that I would look for that I think we really need is more 24/7 safe spaces. We have people living in bus shelters right now because they don't feel safe in some of the shelters, or they feel like their community is very tight in those areas, encampments, those kinds of things. So we do need to provide more safe spaces. I would like to see some of the shelters lower their barriers a little bit, just so that people feel more welcome at all shelters. Main Street, and this is one of the reasons why I chose to volunteer with them, is because they do have is a low barrier shelter, and people don't have to be sober necessarily to be at Main Street. And they also have a facility in the back, which is a kind of like a short-term rehab center, where they call it, if you can get in, it's kind of like they call it a health break, so that you can get in, you can have warm meals, you can live in a comfortable space, and you can kind of just have a break from your life on the street or life of addictions. And so I think we need to partner with the shelters more. The city does fund some van outreach, which I think is really important, because that gives organizations like Main Street an opportunity to go around and make sure that people who are living in tents or in bus shacks are safe and fed, and those kinds of things. So other things that we do need, and speaking to some of the shelters, we need housing. And so housing first policy is really, really important. And I've seen a little bit of a shift in a mindset with some of the shelters in realizing that shelters are emergency spaces only, they're not houses. And we need to make sure that that is fully understood in Winnipeg. This is a temporary place that helps people in moments of crisis. And so the goal is to get people housed within, say, 3 months to a year. And what does that look like? Well, physical housing takes a lot of time to build, and it takes a lot of money. I've worked with the folks who are building 390 Ross. That's an $8 million project. Harriet Housing project is a low-income seniors project. Again, an $8 million housing project. It takes time. And the city puts a lot of barriers in place when it comes to permits and variances and what size of building you can make. Both of those buildings, to build the way they can, they have to go through a variance process. And that just is a very long, time-consuming process that slows things down. It costs more money to build, all of those things. So, and again, it just maybe to close, it's not just one type of housing that we need. We need palliative care housing. We have people in the shelters right now who are recovering from amputations in hospitals or end of life in shelters. It's not a dignified way to spend your end of life or recovery. We need shelters that or we need housing that is focused, wraparound supports for addictions and mental health. Some folks just can't live independently, so they need more supports than others. And then we need just, housing that can support those who are low income and on the verge of homelessness, and need to get back into the workforce or, into a stable housing situation as well.
Going off of what you were saying, the Winnipeg, city of Winnipeg has 40% less staff than other cities, housing staff. Do you plan on creating more positions to alleviate some of the permit times, things like that, and what does that look like?
Yes, so it is a problem, and one other thing I should say about housing is that the big problem in the city is that we've been saying, every time we talk about housing, we're saying it's the province's role. And while housing is a big provincial role, the city has a huge role to play here in a lot of different ways, like exactly what you mentioned in permit processing. So I think that we need to add more staff, and that will be certainly something I look at. However, being somebody who has experienced the permit process firsthand through building my building and other projects in the city, there's a ton of inefficiency in that department right now based on the rules. And we need to look at those rules and figure out how do we make them easier so that this permit process can be faster. The other thing we can look at too is potentially expediting the permit process for not-for-profit housing or low-income, more affordable housing. Those kinds of things would allow it to sort of jump in the queue and basically finish that permit process faster.
And sorry, just one last question. How long would that expedited process be? What is your dream vision?
Yeah, exactly. Well, ideally, if you could get a project off the ground in, let's say, 3 months, that would be ideal. Now, you can get a project off the ground fairly quick in Winnipeg if it meets all of the standard requirements and rules. If it has anything that does not meet those rules, then you have to go into what's called a variance process. They go to the community committee. So that in itself, to get a showing there, takes time. Then it has to go to council to be approved, so that takes time. And what we have to realize is that, especially when it comes to not-for-profit organizations, and for-profit too, is that each time there's a delay, this is time and money that's actually costing the project. So if you think about it from a private developer standpoint, all of that time and the extra money that it does cost, it actually gets put back into the building in terms of rent or those kinds of things, and that's what drives the pricing up as well.
So 3 months?
3 months would be ideal,
Okay.
But to be completely honest about that, is there is such a wide there's such a wide array of times right now that the permit process that it's taking for the permit process, that I would love to get into the department and actually establish a new baseline and figure out what is our baseline right now, so we can have a benchmark going forward. Originally in the process, I had asked a ton of developers. I just said, look, if we can speed up the process by 40%, would that be a big deal to you? They said, of course, but if you could even speed it up 10%, that would be a huge deal to me. So establishing that benchmark and then looking at probably a percentage base, like we do it maybe 20% faster or things like that. And this would be like in terms of days.
We need to move on to our next section, which is transit with Emma Honeybun.
Okay.
Hi there. Excuse me. I'm Emma Honeybone. I'm asking all things transit,
Mhm.
and you have talked a lot about reducing car culture in the city.
Mhm.
How does the transit system play into that? And yeah, what is yours?
Yeah, so I wanted to take a very realistic approach on this because we're not gonna eliminate cars, and that's not the point. And you know, sometimes when we have, let's say, bike culture and car culture, there's this tension, and we need to try to remove that and make sure that everybody's working together. So from a transit standpoint, if we can get people feeling comfortable riding transit, the first goal would be to get the ridership back up to where it was a few years ago, first and foremost. And if we can get more people riding transit after that point, there's just less need to take cars. One of the things I did, you know, for myself early on, I'm a person who likes to not drive every day, so I will sometimes drive to work, I will sometimes take the bus, I will sometimes run, or I will bike. And I actually timed all of those just to see what it would take. So a drive to work is 11 minutes, 12 minutes, and you know, a bike to work is 25, a run to work is 50. And then when I actually did the bus, it was 45 minutes. If I took the bus all the way and I didn't walk that last transfer, so I'm able-bodied, I can easily walk 10 minutes the final transfer, so I don't need to take that second bus. But there's a lot of people who can't, right? And so the first thing we need to do is, I think the master transit plan is actually a really good plan. Like so many plans that we have in the city, we spend a lot of time developing these great plans. The challenge with this plan is the implementation of it. And so one of the first things that I would like to do is expedite the long-term frequent network plan, part of that plan, because if we can create better frequency in buses, then more people will take it, right? I mean, you don't have to worry so much about a bus schedule. The bus comes closer to your house. And that plan, it actually looks to try to bring more buses between 500 and 700 meters, more bus stops between 500 and 700 meters from your house. So if you think about that, it's really only about a 5-minute walk to a bus stop instead of maybe a 10-minute or 20-minute walk. And then you only have to wait maybe, 10 minutes or more for a bus. It comes more often and gets you where you want to go. And we need to make transit more convenient, because right now cars are way too convenient, and we've built a city that is car-centric. And so we need to just switch that as we go forward in the design of our city.
Do you think more frequent transit would also mean safer transit? Because that's also a big issue right now.
I think it's part of it. Yeah, there's a lot of people who I've spoken to who, especially one of the things that I've heard is downtown, especially later at night when people are finishing work, the buses are so full sometimes that they can't get a ride. It doesn't seem like that would be the case, but they're really full at night sometimes coming from downtown. And so if you end up having to stand on the street waiting for the next bus, it doesn't make you feel super safe at times, especially in the dark at night. So I think increasing the frequency, getting more buses on the street will definitely help. More people riding transit will also certainly make the buses feel safer. But I do think there's a lot of other things we have to do to make the buses safer as well, and not just frequency.
And sorry, one more question. How much of the city budget would go towards improving transit?
Ooh, that's a good one. That is a good one. That I actually don't have the number for you on that one right now. Yeah,
Okay.
and it's just like one of those things where, I've spent a long time going through the budgets, and they are listed online for us to view. The challenge is that you often can't really dig down into each line super easy, and so as mayor, to be completely honest, and I've said this right from the beginning, the first thing I would do is want to fling these books open and really start to get an idea from some of these most important departments, like how are we spending money, where are we spending money, and then when it comes to the master transit plan, like that part of making that transit, the long-term frequent network plan happen now, That's reallocating money and trying to get the money for the funding of that happen earlier. Really, it's only about $20-ish million to put that into place, and we've earmarked that to start sort of in 2024, right? And so to get that going, it's going to take about a couple of years just to get the plan going. So if we wait a couple of years to start, and then we wait a couple more years before we can kind of roll it out, we're not looking at getting this part of the plan going for at least 5, 6, 7 years or more.
Moving on to roads, Caleb Dewick.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Shone. I'm Caleb Dewick. I'm covering the issue of roads. I just want to hear generally what you think, and then I have a few follow-up questions.
Sure. So I have come out and said that I believe we should not be prioritizing new roads in the city. I think we should be looking at fixing our roads right now. We do spend about $150 million plus a year. It is record amounts. We're spending record amounts over the last 5 or 6 years. I think we're at the level of funding where we kind of need to be for sure. What it looks like going forward, I'm not sure, but this is where we are starting to make some big changes. But if we continue to prioritize building new roads that are $100 million, $500 million projects, those kinds of things, we are going to slide further behind. Some of the projects, like particularly looking at Chief Peguis or Kenniston widening, there's part of Kenniston that really does need to actually be looked at. But then you look at a project like Chief Peguis, and in my estimation, it's not something that we need to be building right now and taking on that capital cost. So is it something we need to do in the future? Potentially, but not right now. So Winnipeggers want to make sure that they're driving on good roads in our city first. Good roads cost a lot of money, and we have a very short construction season, and so we need to make sure that we're getting those done, and making sure that the potholes are filled and those kinds of things, right? So last year was a great example of how we have a little ability as a city to scale up when we have a major problem, and it took us almost 3-4 months to start catching up and filling those holes.
Thank you. You talk about wanting to reduce traffic congestion downtown. How are you going to do it, and what do you think needs to happen?
Mm-hmm. Well, part of that, again, I think is linked to buses. We have the majority of our bus routes go through downtown, so changing to the long-term frequent network plan will actually remove some of the buses from downtown, particularly. Over time, again, there's a second longer term plan in trying to encourage mode shift with people, so get out of your cars for short distances. If you don't have to use a car for, let's say, a 5-minute drive or a 10-minute drive, get out of your car. We have created a city that we funnel a large amount of traffic right through our downtown. So to be totally honest, this is not going to be an easy situation to solve. I do think we should look at certain things, like in our downtown, we have a ton of one-ways. We should probably look at what that looks like today and see if we can convert those back to 2-ways in some cases. I'm on a lot of those streets downtown during the day, and most of them are totally empty. So we potentially dispersing traffic, from those downtown routes into different streets would also help as well.
Thank you. And you talk about what is it that you mean by reducing car culture, and how do you plan on doing it?
Yeah. Well, I think part of it is just education. We don't do a super great job of when the city comes up with great plans or things like that. If you asked 10 people if they know about it, I would suggest that a high percentage, 9 or 8 or maybe 10 people just have never heard about it. Now the master transit plan is being heard of because we're into an election cycle, but the plan is already a few years old. Most people didn't know about it or even know what was in it until now. And so I think getting that message across to people, creating a city, my belief is that the way we design our city will shape behavior. And so if we're creating wide roads, we are going to create a situation where people just want to drive more often. if we can go back to an idea of 15-minute or 20-minute neighborhoods, those kinds of things, we can encourage people to get out of their cars. We have go back to the time when we had corner stores. I choose to live in a place in the city where I have a corner store 100 meters from my house, coffee shop, restaurants, basically everything I need, for short-term needs is very close to my house. And we've lost that as we've built the city into the suburbs. We've designed suburbs, even places like Waverly West, which are, considered to be a dense neighborhood. There's still a car culture neighborhood because to get out to your commercial services, most people won't choose to bike or walk because it's just too far. So that's the way going forward, and this is a long-term shift, but looking at stuff like, zoning bylaws, parking minimums, getting rid of those, creating a little bit more density in our city, remembering that the core of our city has a ton of financial potential to our city, and encouraging more people to live downtown as well, or downtown or closer to the core.
Right. And what would a 1-year trial of opening Portage and Main to pedestrians look like?
Well,
Why do it that way instead of opening it permanently?
So that was not, just to be totally clear, I saw that one on the website. That's not an official policy statement. That was just a Twitter, statement. I am a proponent of opening Portage and Main. I have been right from the beginning. I don't think we should have put it to a vote. But there is, because it did go there, Caleb, it's a pretty tricky situation because the way it looks now, 75% of the people didn't want it, right? But if you actually look at the people who are living downtown, the majority of people wanted it. So this is something on my radar, and I always thought, we should probably, the way I actually thought about this back when Mayor Bowman was doing it, was we should open up the east side first, one side, get people moving, and just show people that it is possible to have people moving through that intersection.
Mm-hmm.
Moving on to active transportation with Rachel Furstel.
Hi,
Hi.
I'm Rachel, so I'm covering active transportation. How important is this topic and what do you plan to do about it?
Well, it's super important to me personally. I've been cycling in the city for, ever since I, moved here when I was 19. And I guess the first thing I would say is that we have made some major strides in Winnipeg because I've been a cyclist and I've seen it over the past 20 years. There's two things. One is we have way more active transportation infrastructure now than we have in the past. And two is we have way more people riding in the city. And both of those things, I think, should give us hope for the future. Now, the active transportation infrastructure, in my opinion, we're way behind other cities. And the reason why we're behind is because we haven't put the right funding to it. The design has been a bit haphazard, and we sort of focused on areas here and areas here. But really, just until recently, there hasn't been a concerted effort to really make this a vision for the whole city, and how do you connect different areas of the city together. So there's tons of great organizations working on this, and they need to be heard. We need to make sure that they're a part of this conversation. And so the first thing I would do is double the active transportation budget again. Again, I could double it because the funding has been pulled back. I mean, we're not spending enough on it, and doubling it is to be honest, it's just a bare minimum. We have a cycling and pedestrian strategy. There was a $334 million strategy, 20-year plan. At the current rate, I think when I last calculated, it was like if we actually continued at that rate, we would see the whole plan implemented in like 70 years. So I think we need to prioritize this. We need to prioritize it because not only because I just like cycling, but it's encouraging. It encourages people to get out. It encourages people to do healthy activities. And to explore their city in ways that they wouldn't normally. Like when you're on a bike or walking, you might agree, like we just can see the city in different ways, right? We see the people who are experiencing homelessness, or we see the tent encampments. We see the beautiful things like the trees and the buildings and those kinds of things. And we start to notice the areas that are not so great, and we can now look at fixing those and really deciding what our real problems are.
You have a lot of plans about improving active transportation, so which projects are going to be your first priority and why?
Well, I think that some of the most important ones are looking at protected bike lanes. And, as we have more people on the streets cycling, we will probably end up also experiencing more accidents with vehicles. And so, protected bike lanes are extremely important to me. You can, honestly, you can ride on a protected bike lane majority of the times. It's slow speeds, no helmets. It's super safe, very comfortable for children getting to school. My kids cycle to school all the time, so I want them to have a safe ride. And we don't need to have those on all streets, but we do need to have them on streets currently where the speeds are a little bit faster for sure. Some of the other streets, I think we can look at quieter streets. We can look at incorporating cars and cyclists. There's great models about this in Ottawa, where cyclists actually have priority and speed limits are lower. Those kinds of things. So I think the first thing for me would be just looking at the protected bike lanes and trying to, build them as fast as we can and in the right places. So, or getting, there's lots of examples too of looking at getting the cycle pass off the street onto multi-use pass. So combining the sidewalks and cycle pass as well, which I think are great options too.
And you talk about doubling the budget for active transportation. Where is that money coming from, and what costs are going to be cut in order to fund it?
So I believe that we can do this without actually cutting anything. And the reason why I believe this is because if you look at the capital plan for the next 6 years, the majority of those plans are not funded. Okay, and this is just in speaking with organizations like Bike Winnipeg. There is Trails Manitoba. They focus really heavily on building these projects in Winnipeg. And so for new capital projects, the money is out there. We can find it. And the other thing too is that there is money in the road budget for this, and this is another thing in the budget where it's really hard to get an accurate picture, and we spend a lot of time figuring out how much money is actually being spent on this. But it's hard to know because there's a bunch of money lumped into the roads budget when they do road renewals. They also sometimes will look at that, and I say, let's make that as a matter of right. So when you're renewing the roads, let's do the active transportation routes now. It's extremely inexpensive to do it then rather than to redo everything later on, and you can include it in the roads budget. And I'd like to see all funding for active transportation put into one area in the budget, or pulled out like how we have in the budget right now, listed active transportation, so you can clearly see how much of our effort is being put to this.
In the active transportation policy, there's it says for certain road reconstruction project there should already be active transportation in place, but that's not happening.
Yes.
Salter Street, for example, and
Yeah.
Stafford as well.
Mhm.
So if that's already a problem, how do you plan to fix that and make sure those projects do happen?
That's a policy thing. So again, you have to create a policy where when you're doing road renewals, that you're also including the active transportation, which includes pedestrian strategies as well. And it's not happening. One of the reasons they give is that if they're only doing a short section, they don't want to do 100 meters of active transportation routes or bike routes, because then it looks like it's not finished. But again, as you do the next section, then you should build that next section of active transportation in there, because if you don't do it, there's two things. One is you're more likely to never do it, and then the second thing is if you're building upon it, then it's not as a huge a financial hit, and you're always building and growing this network over time.
Thank you.
Moving on to the police budget with Sierra Sanders.
I'm Sierra. I'm
Hi.
covering the police budget. Just want to get your general thoughts and feelings on the police budget, especially with it being so high in some people's
I know.
perceptions. So just your
Yeah.
general feelings and comments towards it.
Yeah. Well, just first, I don't know somebody wrote the article on the website about the police budget. Was that? I don't
That
know.
was one of our last years.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That was a great article, by the way. So worth rereading. So the police budget is a very tricky thing to discuss. I'm well aware, just like anybody else, and full disclosure, my wife is a police officer, and that really doesn't have anything to do with my feelings on the police budget at all. My wife is a great officer who I think is the type of officer that we would really like to see in Winnipeg. But when you look at, so I'm a business owner, and I would do this in my business. If I look at all the departments and I see that one department is costing us an absolute ton of money, and we start to question the efficiency, the value, the levels of service, you have to focus on that budget, and you have to make a few changes. Okay, whether it's reducing budgets or raising revenues to make that budget a smaller percentage of the whole, those are some of the ideas. First and foremost, I have just come out and said that I would, freeze the police budget. It's not been a popular statement with folks in the police department, but they should. Honestly, most people should be happy because there is a lot of people who I've spoken to who just want that budget just cut right now. And I understand that sentiment, but it is extremely difficult to do because of the collective bargaining agreements that we have with the city and the strength of the unions. Not only the police union, but all unions. Unions are great. They protect the employees. They push agendas and interests forwards. But I also think that it's really important to remember that the mayor and city council has the responsibility to the rest of the city to negotiate to the best of their abilities when these contracts come due, because otherwise they can get inflated over time and they end up costing the entire city a lot of money, right? So another thing on the budgeting is that I would personally really like to look at a type of budgeting called priority-based budgeting. So what that is, and I've seen this through my business, I do a lot of work with the government through tendered contracts. And at a certain time of year, you have what's called year end, and in our business it's called March Madness, and it's like a massive amount of spending happens right at the end, because if they don't spend the budget, they're not going to get it again next year. And that's a terrible way of budgeting, because there's just an absolute ton of waste when it comes to that. So the department really should always have to come back and work very hard to really prove why they need that money in the first case, right? It's not just like, yes, I had 300 million last year, so I'm gonna need 2% or 3% next year. I don't believe in that type of budgeting at all. So it is part of looking at the budgeting process. There is a challenge in reducing the police budget right now, because many people, and myself included, also believe that if you decrease the budget in the current way it is right now, you're going to hinder the ability of the police force to do what it's doing at the moment. And again, there are a lot of people who also believe that it's not working in the best manner at the moment as well, and I completely understand that. But this is a long-term solution. This is a thing where you have to look to the future for hiring. What do we look to the future for collective bargaining agreements for pensions? And over time, what we need to say is, as a percentage of our whole budget, what are we okay with spending? Is it 20%? Is it 18%? Is it 25%? Like right now we're at 26, 27%. It's really high, right? So I think those are long answer there, but those are the things that I would look at.
Yeah, is it fair to blame Chief Danny Smythe for Winnipeg Police Service issues? I know you want to end the one of your promises, you want to end the contract with them. When you step back and take a look at the entire department,
Yeah.
Is it fair to blame one person when, in general, in a sense, we should be looking at the entire department itself?
We certainly should be looking at the entire department, and I've been pretty clear about that the whole time. The big challenge right now is that the morale of the police force is low, and the police force, we've known this for years, and so I don't have any personal experience with Chief Smythe. I have nothing personally against Chief Smythe. The problem is that we can really only hear so many times that we have a plan to implement better policing, and then when it just never happens and people are left asking the same questions all the time, at some point you have to look at the leadership. And so we've extended this contract, and me personally, I do believe we should not renew the contract. And also, to be clear, I didn't say fire the police chief, but I do think that it's at the time where he should either resign or we should not renew the contract. And what we should do is we need to be really careful about who we hire going forward, because like I said earlier, as a mayor, I would not have the ability to make change on my own, right? But you need to be able to be the type of person who can inspire and bring your leadership along so that you get everybody on board with the vision that you need. And what that means for the police force is that the leader, the chief, needs to bring all of the managers on board with the vision of what do we want as a city for policing going forward. And that then will start to also, trickle down to the rest of the police force. And so we need to say as a city, what kind of police force do we want going forward? I believe we need a few things in a leader. We need somebody who can inspire a police force, and I just don't think that's Chief Smythe anymore. We need somebody who also can think about it from a business standpoint. So when I brought these things up and people started saying that the police budget was too high, I don't know if you noticed, but there was an article in the Free Press shortly after I brought this up where Chief Smythe now came back and said, well, we actually need more money, right? And so rather than saying, can we work with less, the answer was, no, we just need more money. We also need a chief who understands data, and Chief Danny Smythe is not super technically oriented, and so we need somebody who can look at the stats and start working with these again and make some real progress towards reducing the stats and figuring out how can you do this, where do we deploy people better, those kinds of things. So I think there's a lot of things to be said about that. Not again, it's I have no personal relationship, but at some point we need to look at the leadership and make a change going forward.
That's a good segue into our final topic for the morning, which is crime prevention is our final topic. Kalkadan, introduce yourself, please.
Hi, my name is Kalkadan Mulligeta, so I will be asking questions about crime prevention. So I was just wondering, first of all, like what everyone else was saying, if you could give some general comments about crime prevention, how you feel it's working in Winnipeg, and what your plans are to make it better.
Yeah, I was having a conversation with a couple people the other day, and I realized that I hadn't heard of something called SPY for a long time. It's like special policing initiatives, right? And I asked why, and the reason that I was given was, well, these days we just have no time, and it's not a mandate, right? So back 10 years ago, if bike theft, for example, was really high, the police force would create what is called SPIs, and they would do these special projects to target bike theft. Right now, we don't do those things because the way the system is set up right now, they just don't have time. They're spending too much time in hospitals. They're spending too much time doing wellness checks. So we need to be able to reduce the time that police are spent in those kinds of things. That could be done in combination with social services or by different organizations, maybe a second tier of cadets, those kinds of things, to free them up to be able to do crime prevention. Because I think we also need to be honest that the police they are in a sense crime managers, but the prevention is a hard part of that because you have to be everywhere at one time, and that's just not possible, right? But if you get to the point where the fear of getting caught is completely gone from everybody's thought process, then we start to get into a position where we have what we experienced with the liquor stores a few years ago. And my business is a retail business, and when that started happening, we saw that start occurring in our business and other small businesses. And so the idea that nobody was ever going to catch you or punish you started to proliferate in the city. And we came up with a different way of dealing with that in our store, which was more of a just like extremely customer service oriented. But it is a problem. In my neighborhood, this morning I was driving down the street and I saw a fellow pushing a cart with 4 bikes in it. And so when you see something like that, you're just like, okay, there's a problem here because that's not a normal thing that you see, and it does lead one to question. We have increasing assaults in the city. Those are really hard things to prevent if you don't have the fear of being caught. So one of the things my wife was actually a foot patrol officer for the last 4 years, and so there is a risk in foot patrol because you don't want to. Your officers have to be trained in trying to overcome their biases and again just meeting people where they are. But the foot patrol can have a lot of ability in areas like downtown, to just elevate people's concept or belief of safety if it's done right. I think stuff like incorporating more bike patrol can also have that, because the foot patrol's area is so small because they're on foot, they can't cover places like the Forks or the Exchange or, you know, all those areas. I don't think this means more police on the ground. I think just means just shifting police into, you know, into different roles. And going back lastly to the discipline part of it, I completely understand the situation in our jails, the overpopulation of Indigenous members of our society. Jail is not the answer always, but the length of time between sort of getting caught for committing a crime and being punished, whether it's any kind of discipline, such as community services, or in my case, we've had people who have had to pay back, you know, nominal amounts of that, you know, and it's having those kinds of things are really important as well. So in that is making sure that our justice system is also doing what they need, you know, to do to ensure that, you know, people are sort of disciplined or held accountable for the crimes that they are committing in a, you know, in a shorter period of time. So property crime is a huge issue in our city. It is costing people a lot of money. And then I guess last to say here is this is a super complicated topic, is how do you prevent crime, again, because you really can't be everywhere at all times. But the last thing I want to say about this is that it's important to bring it back to people. And there are a large percentage of people who are committing crimes because they are addicted to drugs, they are experiencing mental health issues, or lower income, let's say. And that is a situation that, to me, preempts crime in the matter of importance in our city. Because if we can help people find housing, find employment, find supports, you know, we will also prevent a lot more crime. And long-term, making sure kids have programming through arts, recreation centers, you know, things to do on the street, I think are all important ways of preventing crime.
You mentioned that you wanted to increase funding to community patrol groups and organizations like that.
Mm-hmm.
So how much money do you plan to give to those community patrol
Mm-hmm.
groups, and which ones specifically?
Community patrol groups?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, so there are a lot, and there are a lot of good ones. When I was with Central Neighborhoods, we funded a couple of them already. And to be honest, a lot of the funding actually comes from the province, which is important. I think the province needs to play a role here. So as mayor, you need to, and council, we need to make sure that we are aligning those interests with the province, and that funding always comes. So Downtown Community Safety Patrol is also funded by the province. But so at this time, I haven't put any hard dollar figures attached to it. It's more just in saying that when these organizations come to the city looking for help, we shouldn't be putting up roadblocks, because they are a high priority. They are doing something that we as a city and all people in Winnipeg want them to do. More eyes on the streets. They're reaching out and connecting with people in a different way that police can't. No uniforms, you know, no judgment, like less bias, those kinds of things. They're sometimes even coming from a place of experience. They've experienced homelessness themselves or addictions and those kinds of things, and that's important. So there's other organizations too, like that I've worked with, like Spence Neighborhood Association, Rossbrook House, like all these places that if you need better funding, then the city should not be putting up roadblocks. And you know, we should be creating a couple staff people in the city to make sure that we have advocates for organizations like that as well.
And what are your plans to address violent crime towards Indigenous women and girls within the city of Winnipeg?
Mm-hmm. So my two brothers are Cree, and I've grown up seeing their experience. It's not my experience. It's, you know, their experience of not fitting in, racism. My younger brother suffered from FASD all his life, and so one of the things that you know, when I had looked, I think it's important that all of us read the calls to actions, the TRC calls to actions. There's a few that I would, you know, point out really quickly in there. is that creating FASD programs, that's something that we as a city can work with people to take care of and to build. And the reason for that was it came originally, I think, from my personal experience with my brother, but also realizing that it's something that will affect a person that they had no control of overall. So if we can help the parents into more programs like that, I think it's really important. And yeah, also just kids programming. So protecting the youth, making sure that the kids have things to do. A lot of kids right now, and I lived in the North End for 5 years, on Mountain and Garley's, and so you can see, there's kids out on the street till like 11, 12, 1 o'clock at night. There's just no support really, or little parental support. We need to do everything we can as a city to work with them. And one of the things I also had mentioned was to make better relationships with First Nation bands, the leaders of First Nation bands, and offer the support that we need to help them, whatever it might be, because we have a lot of Indigenous people moving to Winnipeg, and one of the largest growth in our population in the next 20 years will also be significantly Indigenous as well. We talk a lot about newcomers coming to Winnipeg, but I don't think we talk enough about the reality that a lot of the newcomers will actually just be coming from the First Nation bands. And when they come to Winnipeg, we need to be able to connect them with supports. We need to be able to connect them with the jobs, housing. Otherwise, they're going to end up on the street, and the violence and cycles will just continue.
That's all the time we have for Rick.
Okay.
Shone,
Thank you.
thank you.
Amazing questions. Thanks for putting me sort of on the spot, but I'm getting a little more used to answering them, so I really appreciate that. And I told James earlier, but yeah, the work I'd seen you all do so far is pretty awesome. So and a lot of people are looking at it. So I think that's important to remember, is that there are actually a lot of people really looking at the work that you're putting out there, and it's helping them make a more informed decision about me and everybody else in the campaign.